Welcome to the Profitable Farmer Podcast, where it's all about increasing the profitability of your farm by working smarter, not harder.
G'day and welcome to Profitable Farmer. Again, wonderful to have you involved with us. Today we have what I believe to be a really critical topic for family farming businesses across Australia and beyond. It's a topic I think that is largely and often misunderstood. And there is a lot of emotion often that comes up when we mention this word succession. And so it was wonderful now a week and a half ago to have Tony Catt from Catapult Wealth join our clients at our deep dive. And I'm going to name it straight up that Tony delivered what I believe to be the single most refreshing and significant presentation on succession that I've ever seen. And so it's with that in mind that I am really excited today to explore this whole conversation of farm succession, perhaps how it's misunderstood in industry, perhaps how we can simplify it with good rigor and good planning, and how we can help explore. Let's explore how we can help individual families across Australia navigate this conversation. So, Tony, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate you having me on.
Great to have you involved. And as I say, it was just wonderful to hear your take and your experience and wisdom in this area, Tony. So to get us underway, what is your definition, Tony, of this, I'm going to say, misunderstood word succession?
Well, firstly, I mean, I would argue that succession planning is a dirty word in a lot of farming communities, in that some communities don't even like turning up to seminars locally because they're afraid of succession being or transition sometimes being so poorly handled or so badly done that it can be associated with failure. And so a lot of farmers tend to not talk to each other about it. They tend to not talk to their advisors about it. And they, because they're worried about what the outcome may be and therefore worried about the negative consequences of it. You know, so my view is that I think I prefer the word transition, or I'll use the word the infinite game. These are topics that should be just seen in a positive light. You know, there's an old saying that a lot of someone planted an acorn many years ago for you to enjoy the shade you're living under today. Is that I think that's an ongoing process, and I think people need to keep planting acorns. You know, so my view is that we, on good governance, good business governance, good communication, good open honesty about where all the family is in this journey is critical to good transition. And I think we just have to take away that negative stigma that's associated with this stuff, because it's horrible, to be honest, Jeremy. I find that it can be a positive experience is probably the feedback I'll give you. But it's really important that the people have a good framework, which I'm happy to talk about today, a good positive mindset, and a good sense of honesty and approach and comfort and trust with one another, that they can go into this and get a good outcome.
Yep. So perhaps before we get into that, though, just to explore, given your experience in this, what is it that keeps people from wanting to talk about this? Is it bad previous experience and worry, or is it more than that?
Oh, look, I think there's a variety of factors, Jeremy. I think the first thing I will say is the biggest roadblock is normally the patriarch or matriarch of the family just doesn't want to deal with it. Look, and I'm going to throw it out there, is that sometimes some of that generation get into a point where either, you know, they don't want to emotionally deal with it, they don't want to physically deal with it, they can't. It's so complicated. It's probably another reason, is that it's so complicated that they get overwhelmed by it. They're afraid of upsetting the apple cart. You know, like they go, well, this has always worked for us, so therefore, you know, the old theory, they always go, well, what got us here will get us there. That's completely untrue. So I'll say there's some roadblocks in that regard. There's also some roadblocks in, I'll call it the Mexican standoff theory, where, the father or mother sit there of a family farm and go, well, we just want the kids to tell us what they want to do, and then you talk to the kids, and the kids go, well, we just want mum and dad to tell us what they want to do. And inevitably what happens is no one talks to anybody.
Yep.
And it's very frustrating to watch. I think that human nature is that we don't like hard conversations, Jeremy. Giving each other feedback, or giving each other some honest feedback about where they're heading in life, or what they like or don't like, or and also, what bottom line is, letting people down. I think that there is an underlying emotional issue in farming that, son number one, or being stereotypical, or son number two will take over. And that expectation, as those kids get older, gets, I'll call it, ingrained just through unconscious behaviour. And then children or next geners feel like they're, letting their parents down. It is an emotional web of stuff that people find very hard. They're not well equipped to deal with, and therefore it just gets put on the back burner. And unfortunately, that doesn't solve it.
No. How did you come to this space and helping families in this way, Tony?
It's a good question. So there was really, I was introduced to it in two ways. One is through my job of helping farming families through retirement planning. So, retirees would get to a certain age in their life where they'd turn up and see a financial planner and go, look, Tony, I'm 65 years of age, and I need to retire. How do I do it? And what I was getting is a lot of people that were doing it far too late in life. They were coming to me at 65 years of age, even later. And then, it's very hard to undo things or fix things that late. The second way is I married into a farming family from the Riverland, and have seen from the inside out some of the hard things that go on in families of dealing with generational transition. And so I'm officially titled an outlaw of the family. So I married a daughter of a farmer, and have been actively involved for 20 years now of working through the family's issues and plans and goals and transitioning the farm from one generation to the next. So I've seen it from the outside in and the inside out. And I just genuinely believe that a lot of the farmers around all around the world, but more importantly around South Australia, I just sat there and looked at it, and they need help. They really need a lot of help, and they need a lot of good advice, and they need an unbiased, unemotional person or people to be around them to help them navigate this stuff.
Yeah. So I recall you speaking about a dead plan versus a living plan, and also governance versus succession. I'd love for you to explore those concepts, because I think within that we sort of get to bust a few myths or misunderstandings around this conversation.
Yeah. So I'll probably deal with the governance versus succession first. Is a common misconception, I'll say, is that people think succession planning is an event. They go, right, well, they walk into my office and say, Tony, we need a succession plan. And the trouble with that is it's not a static document. It's not a static event. It is an ongoing event. And I believe that the way it should be approached is around, if you approach it from, we're a business, we're going to be a business for the next 30 or 40 years plus, we need good governance in place. And what I mean by governance is people have regular meetings, they have agendas, they know what hat they're wearing when, so they know when they're representing the business ownership, they know when they're representing the management team, and through good governance of knowing of running a good business with good rhythms and systems and processes. An outcome of that will be succession. So if you are, you've got a board meeting, effectively next generational ownership should always be on the agenda every meeting. It's not just once or twice every 10 years. This is a constant conversation, and how are we working through those issues on a monthly, 6-monthly, 12-monthly basis, not just every now and again. And so it's my humble belief that succession is a outcome of good governance, not oh, we just need a succession plan, because I just think that's just doesn't work. And I hope that makes sense. But
yeah, absolutely, it does. And just on that too, I reflect on, as an example, outside agriculture, professional service firms, accounting firms, law firms.
Yeah.
They might not always achieve that intergenerational transition within a family, though they might. But would you mind just sort of using perhaps an example for how that plays out practically from a governance standpoint outside agriculture? Because absolutely those same business principles applied well can simplify this whole piece perhaps for farming families.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, inside an accounting firm or law firm or a lot of different businesses where it's not, I'll call it family related, governance is crucial, where you are talking about intergenerational, maybe share ownership, where you are approaching a 28-year-old or 30-year-old in their career and dealing with perhaps how they see their career progressing in terms of equity buy-in or profit share. And you're taking them through a journey towards perhaps being a director of the business or a major shareholder of the business. It's a very structured conversation that's ongoing to progress someone through those phases or stages of their career. And at different times, those people might withdraw, they might pull out and sell. But it is clear that that it's not just an event that happens, once every 60 years. It's something that happens every month or every 6 months. Whereas, and I'll argue, just while I'm on the topic, Jeremy, is that a lot of families, I put them in two major categories. They're either a family first business or what I call a business first business. And a lot of family first businesses really probably are a little bit, there's a job for the nieces, the nephews, and everyone gets probably paid under what they should be paid. And it's sort of like, well, how do we help the family? And just let's do all this together. And it's more of a community approach to the business. Whereas a business first business doesn't really place any emphasis on what your last name is or whether you're part of the family. We just want the best person for the job. And we want to know that the business is profitable, the business is running under the certain set of KPIs, that we've got the right pegs in the right holes effectively. And if someone within the family is not the right person for the job, they don't get the job. And so I think that business first approach, and not that I'm saying either approach is right or wrong, but particularly with governance, having good governance is more of a business first approach.
Yeah, and I think from a leadership standpoint, I like the frame that leadership's about giving people certainty. Yes. And if we think about that accounting or law firm example, that as a graduate coming into that company, it's well spelt out in policy that if I hang around for 8 or 10 years and that I hit these milestones year on year for the next 8 years, that, as you say, I might get a profit share, I might be able to buy in, I might at some point be able to become an active director and owner in the company. I think that spelt out in policy is good governance and good practice outside agriculture. Do you see a place for that sort of forethought and that sort of structure for farming families?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, I'll say that unfortunately in my career, I've seen too many farming families and next gen, as I'll call, live on a promise.
Yep.
And living on a promise ultimately creates, and I'm going to say this, trying to say this nicely, it can create, I'll use this term, but it's probably not the right word, imprisonment. So if you have said, right, you've been promised the farm, you've been promised the farm, you've been promised the farm, and suddenly 20 turns into 30, turns into 35 years of age, and for 15 years you've been underpaid, promised a lot, you reach a point where you feel like you can't turn back, Jeremy. You reach a point where you go, I need to stick this out because this is what I've been promised. And that is just an emotional minefield, particularly when you introduce wives or partners or children into that equation. And then the trouble is, that their expectation or their promise, depending on seasons, rainfall, we've seen an interesting 5 years in farming land. Things go wrong. And therefore, how long is a piece of string? How long do these promises go for? And so what I'm trying to do is argue for the opposite of that. Have a framework. Clearly, the first stage that is super important in a family business like the farming families is the day that your 18-year-old steps back onto the farm, because you want that they want that certainty, they want that framework, they want to know what their job is, who they're reporting to, they want to know what their pay packet looks like, they want to know what their holidays look like, they want to know what's expected of them and how to succeed. They're craving that, and we shouldn't underestimate that.
Perfect. So the other comment that I would like to explore is your reference to dead plan versus living plan, Tony. So would you mind speaking to those two things for us?
Yeah, so I guess, unfortunately, again, the dead plan, and again, I'll say this lightly, is dying's easy, but a lot of farmers have adopted the approach over the last 20 years of me looking at this and going, well, this will all be yours when I'm gone, sort of attitude. And yes, that can be a plan, and it is definitely an important part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process. And so the dead plan is the will. And so, what if dad dies? What if mum dies? What if they both die together? What happens with the farming business or the farming entities? That is a crucial part of the puzzle. And while I'm on that topic, that is a moving document as well. So as years glide by and the business evolves and changes and on-farm and off-farm children evolve, that dead plan needs to move all the time. Too many people, and I'm going to use my own father in a case, who was a lawyer, by the way, who drew up a will when he was remarried and then didn't look at it again until 20 years later when he did die at 57 years of age, and he completely stuffed his will up. And it didn't move with the times. And so, as much as we say, a lot of people go, I've done my will, it's put in the bottom drawer, and people need to pick it up, reread it, check in with it, understand if it's still relevant to the circumstances of the day, and if it's not, change it. You have to assume that you when you do a dead plan, you can't assume that you die in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. You have to assume you're going to die tomorrow. And is this dead plan written according to that?
Is it an annual thing, do you think, Tony, that review needs to take place?
Oh, look, at the very least, I'm not purporting that. Lawyers are expensive and things are expensive, but I'll tell you what's more expensive is if it goes wrong. You've seen a lot of places that end up in court and it costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix these things if they don't go well. And so, unfortunately, I do get sometimes the attitude, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm dead, so no one cares. Well, your loved ones around you, they care, and you don't want to leave behind a mess. And I've been involved in that, and I've seen it happen. It's not okay. And so even if at a bare minimum you pick it up on an annual basis and just reread it, have a glass of red wine, say, yep, read it. It's okay. Put it back in the bottom drawer. But please don't ignore it.
Would you say that it's quite common that the people do have, and perhaps an up-to-date will, but the family doesn't know the contents of that until their death? We're talking about the dead plan, and perhaps often a lack of communication around that. Is that something you see regularly in industry?
Yeah, yes, I do. And unfortunately, I see some professional advisors even recommending to clients that they don't communicate what's in their will to their children. Look, again, my view is that I've recommended every single one of my clients that you sit your family down and you talk about it. How you do that is up to each individual family, but there are a lot of things that are written in wills that need explanation, and they need discussion, and they need, I'll call it, flavour. And therefore, and again, I'll use my father as an example, is that he died and he left behind a will that there were so many questions I had for him about that will that once he was gone, I can't wake him up again and ask him. So I think sitting your family around, having a chat about it, and again, maybe dealing with the fallout of that and dealing with any animosity it creates, that's okay. I'd rather deal with that up front and you could discuss it and work it through. Trying to deal with it after the fact is nigh on impossible.
So what is the living plan in comparison?
Yeah, well, a living plan is just assume you live till you're 100, Jeremy, I suppose, is that, I mean, it's all well and good to plan for your death, but let's plan to live 40 or so good years and make sure that, what does that look like? And that's the trouble with the living plan is a lot of people find that very complicated. They find it very, there's a lot of moving parts to it, dealing with all the different business entities, the emotional parts, as I said earlier. But the living plan is a plan that says, right, well, I'm going to see this business out, I'm going to transition it to the next generation, and I'm going to retire and I'm going to enjoy my life. And so it's really just planning for success is what a living plan is. And success being, I'm going to live till I'm 100. And we just think that a living plan comprises of 4 major components. So the first component is a retirement plan. How is stereotypically mum and dad going to retire from the business? So what income do they need? What assets do they need? How are they going to be cared for from a healthcare point of view, which is often overlooked, like retirement, aged care facilities and things like that.
Yep.
Who's responsible for that? So what does their life look like? What are their wishes and how do they want it to look?
So that needs to be a documented retirement plan. It's one thing for the mum and dad to have that in mind and in their head, and again, have not shared that down the line. But I guess you're talking about having a documented and written and regularly updated formal retirement plan for the older generation. Is that correct?
100%.
Thank you.
And yeah, 100%. And that ultimately, even if it involves getting the age pension or things like that, and the sooner you have that conversation, the better, because of asset gifting rules and Centrelink rules and all these sort of things that need to be discussed. They need to be discussed ahead of time, and so I guess that's probably the first step. And I'm firmly of the view that until that first domino falls, like mum and dad really know what their direction is, even if it's 95% of they know what they want, then at least the rest of the dominoes can fall in a sense that you can make some plans around them. And in a contextual sense, I've said, Jeremy, that in a cold light of day, a transition from one generation to the next is mum and dad are the seller and the next generation are the buyer. And mum and dad need to know on what framework they're selling it. What's the price? What are the terms of the sale? Yep. And in a contextual sense, the buyer, being the next generation, needs to know how they're buying it. Like, what is my obligations? How much do I need to pay over time? Do I need to pay a lump sum? What are my liabilities? What does my debt look like? What am I buying? And so contextually, a buyer and seller need to get together and agree to a set of terms. And I think that's really important, just to phrase it like that or frame it like that.
It's a really important way to frame it. And in reality, that's exactly what's happening. But it's the terms often that aren't clear or aren't spoken about, both with the on-farm children, but certainly and often with the off-farm children, Tony.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably, again, where I think that some advice or sometimes the system breaks down or the process breaks down, where the off-farm children either are ignored or given pretty short shrift, is that I've described the off-farm children as emotional owners of the business. It's often in a house they've grown up in. It's where they've had their childhood memories. It's where they've probably, invited their school friends around. It's where they probably had 18th and 21st birthday parties. So,
Yep.
I think that the off-farm children need to clearly be involved in the conversation, and they are, and they need to be involved, particularly along the way where mum and dad and any on-farm children make it clear how this is all working. And again, that's not an easy conversation to have. But that transition to off-farm children, because a lot of off-farm children perceive a generational transfer of farms as an opportunity. I'm going to use it as an opportunity given to the on-farm child, and their major beef, a lot of off-farm children, is what opportunity are we given? What's our opportunity to go and start a business or get a career or earn some money or get on with our lives? And it's a difficult conversation to have, but it's a really important conversation to have.
I would imagine that it's that perceived misalignment in opportunity that is perhaps more the issue than the actual end result. Is that Fair, Tony?
Yeah, it's often not about the money. It's just about, as I said, the opportunity. What have you? It's defined as a leg up, because we all know farming can go bad. You can give an opportunity to somebody and they could lose money for the next 10 years of their life, and it's pretty tough going.
Yep.
Living in remote locations, it's certainly not seen as a cup of tea, but it is definitely about the opportunity rather than the money. The second stage, Jeremy, that I was going to talk about is behind the retirement plan. There's probably 3 concurrent plans that we talk about with clients, where we talk about a management plan. And so, when does a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 35-year-old, how are they progressing in a career sense through learning how to manage the operation? And there needs to be timeframes, responsibilities, job descriptions, training put around that management plan, so that the next generation is learning how to take that responsibility, and that needs to be clearly outlined and framed. Concurrently, then we talk about I'm going to call it who controls the checkbook plan. Most farming families will have really probably ownership in 2 different buckets. They'll have ownership of the land or the underlying farmland in a trust perhaps, and then they'll have their operating entity in another trust or a partnership. And what we're then looking for is then how do you progress if the farm makes $300,000 a year in profit? Who decides where that money goes? Who decides, is it reinvested back in the farm? Who decides, is it paid out as dividends? Who decides that you buy more machinery? Who decides that we expand more into more land? That is how do you introduce the next generation into that conversation? Needs planning and forethought, and to a point where ultimately at some point they control the whole checkbook, and mum and dad don't control it anymore at all.
So it is literally who makes the decisions around how we allocate funds in any normal year, and that in and of itself requires forethought and transition, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
Yep.
And to do that properly, and this is also where I get involved, is that, you need to be able to read a balance sheet, read a profit and loss, understand the next 5-year planning, because if you just turn up to those meetings and go, well, what do we do with the $300,000? If you've got no framework to make that decision, it's really hard. So next gens need to be trained in getting involved either at advisory board level or family board level, where they understand what the bigger picture is, they understand what all the moving parts are, they understand what the balance sheet looks like, so they can help make those decisions.
Yep. Absolutely. And that's a whole nother conversation really around how to manage decision-making on farm operationally, but more so the key decision-making around business advancement between generations.
Well, what happens is that you typically run into a generational change is you've got competing goals, Jeremy. Like you've got competing goals where I would argue mum and dad are becoming, they need, cash flow for retirement purposes, travel, maybe a retirement home, but then you've got the competing, and also probably I will argue they're becoming more adverse in their risk tolerance. So their risk tolerance is going down, not up. Whereas then your competing generation with a 30 or 40-year-old couple coming back onto the farm, their risk tolerance is high. Maybe their level of debt tolerance is high. And then you've got competing cash flow needs where maybe the next gen is maybe sending kids to private school or education costs or mortgage costs. So cash flow and discussing cash flow across generations is quite an interesting conversation. But again, you need everyone at the meeting. You need everyone to discuss it, air it, and talk about how you're dealing with it. Because as I often say, is the fairies aren't coming down and sprinkling fairy dust and making this stuff go away. The only way you're going to deal with it is to deal with it, bring it up, air it out, and take some action.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Tony, that it makes perfect sense that younger generation coming through might have a very different set of priorities and an appetite to risk, as you say, than the older generation. But I think if we can frame good communication around that so that we're focusing on both of those things, so it's making sure that we are respectful and acknowledging and planning for the older generation's retirement, but then also how we achieve the younger generation's goals and priorities. It can absolutely, with good communication, be a both rather than an either or, which is, I'd imagine, where conflict comes up.
Spot on. And ultimately too, there's, I will argue that successful businesses, not just through good communication, having a good business with good cash flow and a good, which you guys are doing at FOA, trying to teach them to run a better business, it helps those decisions, if you know what I mean. Like, if you're making $500,000 a year, trying to decide where the cash flow goes is a lot easier than making $100,000 a year. But so running a good business is still paramount. But there's a lot of those things I understand you can't control. But the other thing I just need to understand, I want probably your listeners to understand, is there's also a lot of emotional issues that go with cross generations. So I very clearly want to frame to the next gen is that mum and dad, and particularly farmers, that it's really important they don't lose their sense of purpose. And I want to just say that, and that's probably just an emotional context, is if and I'm going to be stereotypical, if a father then is, his son comes in and says, Dad, get out of my way, I want to do this, you're stepping on my toes and I don't need you around. That can be emotionally very hard for some of those older generational farmers, and they lose their sense of purpose. It affects their mental health. It affects their partner's mental health, and I've seen a number of cases where that ends up in really poor outcomes. And so I just, as a bit of advice to the next gen, is be very mindful of the mental health of your parents moving forward, about how you handle this and how they react to it, and the timing around it. It's really crucial.
There's a huge element, Tony, of being respectful and patient as the incoming younger generation, perhaps even more so than we think we need to be. So that, those emotional issues that no doubt the older generation will need to navigate with any major change like this are considered and part of the staging of this process.
Yeah, and once you've got a level of awareness and or even help the next generation create, and I call it a rock to hop to, help them design what their next sense of purpose is, whether it be charity work or working in some other capacity, or it can often be a staged outcome, but helping them go through that together rather than feel like they're working through it alone is really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd imagine where for most of that generation's lives, their vision has only been around the farm and providing for their children. Some support from the younger generation to help them redefine a vision that might be off farm and might be focusing on new projects outside of the industry or of the property. It's a really important piece in the puzzle.
Yeah, it is, and if you want to, and if everyone's serious about it, and and the outcome is, the goal is that we always want to have Christmas dinner together and enjoy our lives. You're in this for everybody, not just how do we make I think we get a bit bogged down in how do we just make the farmer success, but there's more elements to this, and it might be, as you said, getting new projects for mum and dad to get on with. It's still part of making, I'll call this journey or this transition, a success. It has to be a success for one generation and the other generation leaving, not just the incoming generation.
Yep. So what's the fourth plan under the Living Plan umbrella?
Yeah, the fourth plan is really just around that ownership transition. Again, a lot of people make the misconception that succession's all about when does the land transfer, and ultimately the land transfer is, for me, it's always been the last piece of the puzzle to fall. So getting the retirement plan, getting the management plan, getting the control, the checkbook plan all done, transferring the land is normally just the last thing, and particularly in trusts and that, where and it's whether the land's worth $5 million or $10 million or $15 million, a lot of farms are never sold. So what it's worth on paper and can be largely irrelevant, but it is seen as it is something that is done, and it has to be part of the plan. But I don't think people put far too much emphasis on it too early on, and I think that it needs to be dealt with, but not dealt with until probably nearly last.
Mm-hmm. So the operational transition, I think it's a fair comment that it's the operational asset that probably makes most of the money. farming the capital assets. So I guess your focus in the up front is it more around the transition of operations and the operational asset? Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, good operational outcomes will just lead to, I think, will be key here. And I often use the phrase where income drives your lifestyle, assets don't drive your lifestyle. So income, pays for the bills. Income pays for, helps you get more debt if you want to buy more land. Income helps these things. The assets atypically don't. You can have a lot of assets but not be able to pay bills. And so driving the operational side and making sure that is efficient, running well, and controlling the controllables, which I understand is a big issue, is crucial. And so, yes, that is a priority.
Excellent. Thank you. So how would you suggest people make a start? If there are probably two scenarios here, Tony. One where we've tried and failed. We've come together as a family and we've had our first crack at this a few years ago and it didn't go well, so we just haven't revisited it. Or we're sort of in the early stages of needing to get this underway but not knowing where or how to start. What advice do you have for farming families on how to make this their priority?
Yeah, I guess I'll deal with the false start one first. Is don't give up is probably my underline. I know that sounds easy, but keep trying to find the right advisors, keep trying to find the right people, keep trying to have the conversation, because ignoring it won't make it better and ignoring it won't fix it. But ultimately maybe rephrasing it to say that, depending on what your roadblock is, rephrasing the importance of it, reframing it. There will typically be, where some people are stuck, there'll be typically a moment in time where they become, I'll call it, unstuck. And it might be a life event, it might be their health, it might be something that happens around them. It might be a conversation, it might a penny will drop at some point, but keep changing things until you get the outcomes you want and need, I think, is crucial. Giving up won't solve it. And so I just encourage those clients who have had false starts to not think that this is just a waste of time or this will never work, because I could give you a long lineup of circumstances where not only will it work, it is imperative to make it work. And if you want a successful transition from one generation to the other, you have to keep working on this stuff. And on that front also, I do talk a bit about just building deeper relationships within the family. I think relationship building within the family, where sometimes we take family for granted, and where you sort of get up and you get out and work, and your brother, you assume is always going to be your brother and always be there for you. But we tend to stop building relationships with family. We stop trying, I guess is probably a better way of framing it, with one another. And I think we have to stop and continually build relationships with each other. Keep doing the dinners, keep going out for breakfast, keep talking, keep taking a genuine interest in one another, because ultimately then more trust will be built, better communication will be built, and better outcomes will come from that. So my advice would be just work on the relationships.
Brilliant. So Tony, perhaps just starting in wrapping up, we hear perhaps in all of our communities the war stories around this, and it's probably where the stereotype has arrived to. Would you mind sharing a success story? Have you got a client that focused on this early, that got really good governance structures and even policy in place, and that it's kind of preset early in their journey with a new generation coming through? Have you got a story that you might share?
Yeah, look, I think, I do, and it's a client in South Australia that very early on identified that there was some risk, even at a very young age, that their 3 kids may or may not come back on the farm. But we had to build it so that they weren't sure whether 1, 2, or 3 might come back. They weren't sure if none would come back, and ultimately they went and at a very young age and put together a board, an advisory board around them, as what we define it as. And so there's on that board sits an accountant, a farm advisor, and myself as the financial planner, along with the 2 kids. Along with the parents, and that evolved over time as the kids grew up, and there was a clear framework around them having to go away and be educated a certain way. There was clear policies and discussion around that. Then it evolved where they got to an age where they invited them to come to the board meetings. So, and it was at that stage the kids were, I'll call it single. So they were invited, they came along.
Yep.
They were invited to contribute, and they were invited to listen to what was going on around. And those meetings were held on either 3 times a year, maybe 4 times a year, depending on the circumstances. Then it evolved where the kids started getting involved with the farming family. 2 went off farm, 1 went on farm, but where partners, then of course we had introduced, people got married. And what this family took was the approach that although we didn't want too many people around, I'll call it the advisory board table, that they felt it was more upside than downside to invite the partners along, and they thought it would create, so all of the kids, both on farm and off farm, were still invited to the advisory board meetings, believe it or not. And because it dealt with on-farm and off-farm assets, it didn't just deal with on-farm assets, and all the partners were involved as well. So they didn't run into the drama of miscommunication or things being relayed poorly back to their partners. And then ultimately, just through constant advisory board meetings, constant agenda actions, good solid structured communication, they have successfully transitioned this farm to the next generation, and even to the point where this family actually introduced a once-a-year family getaway. So what they did is they purposefully said, we just need to get away from the farm. We just want to be a family together. And so they would organise a family getaway, whether it be for a week, I don't know, the Streaky Bay Caravan Park, I don't really care where you go, is that, they introduced this concept of a family getaway where they could just talk about family issues, not business issues. And they had a night where in the middle they had a room, they went through some family issues. And every year they did this, and I felt like, and I know the feedback was, it was a huge success because it helped air out any family issues. It was the right forum for it. It was private, it was intimate, and it helped develop their relationships, which, as I said, a lot of people take for granted. So, this has been going on. I've been dealing with this family for 20 years. And I will argue that the next generation who pick it up, when mum and dad don't do it anymore, don't share it anymore, are going to continue with that plan, keep running the same meetings, keep running the same systems, running the same processes for their kids. And I think the next generation will be walking into a great system and a great governance structure that will ultimately lead to a great success.
Such a great example, and I can only imagine as the outlaw coming into that, be it a young man or a young lady, that over time, for that structure, that they will feel informed, included, and that potential issues would have to be reduced for having a system and a governance framework like that. What a great example.
It looks professional. I guess on that note, I'll just probably touch on, Jeremy, that it does bring a wry smile to my face when I hear some families in very remote parts of Australia saying, where they effectively an in-law is introduced to this, I'll call it the family network, and they nearly shun them. Like they nearly treat them as an outcast. And I'm thinking, we don't have a lot of good access to help in some of these communities. Like, don't try and look at this as a bad outcome. Look at it as a great outcome. There's now hopefully a great, clever person that wants to buy into this process that can help build it, not as a threat. Look at it as an opportunity.
There can be a whole lot of fears that might come up about things that could happen, but if we let those go and just focus on what the opportunity might be for bringing them along for the ride, I think more often than not it's going to be favourable.
Correct.
Yeah. Tony, thank you for your time. It's been great to explore this a little further. I'm sure you and I could keep chatting on this all day. We recommend you and Catapult Wealth, and to all of our listeners, highly recommend Tony and his team. Tony, how are people listening to this that want support professionally from you best able to make contact?
Look, either probably email, or just tony@catapultwealth.com.au, or just reach out through our website. We've got an email address, so if you want to check us out and about how we do things, feel free to go through our website at catapultwealth.com.au. Either or. I'm more than happy to take queries. We just sit down in an initial meeting and we can walk through over a cup of coffee what you're going through, what your feelings are, and whether we can add any value or help in any way. And that initial meeting's all free, so that's fine.
Great, thank you, Tony. And I guess as a bit of a shout out to the Take Control program that we run in Farm Owners Academy, is that everything we're about is helping farming families get business management structure, better communication and better governance frameworks in and around how decisions are made, how planning is done, and how your farm business is managed. So it's with that in mind that I guess we see such an alignment here with Catapult Wealth, where we can be working with you directly and helping you build up some of those business governance frameworks that in time and completely support the best outcome in terms of succession, especially when you're supported by professionals like Tony and his team from outside looking in. So, ladies and gents, I hope that has been useful. I think it's a critical conversation. We want to see more and more farming families, I know Tony and his team do, getting this right by being proactive and by applying good business practice to farming dynamics in agriculture. So, Tony, any final comment from you?
Just get out and do it. Start the conversation today, no matter how hard it is. And I've come from a baseball background, Jeremy, and so you have a saying: you can't steal second without taking your foot off first. So take your foot off first and risk it.
Yeah, good. Be courageous and be proactive. Absolutely. Tony, thanks for your time. Great to connect again. And to everyone listening, have a great month, and we'll check in again shortly. Bye for now.
Jeremy.